In the quiet heart of a small American town, two teenagers vanished without a trace. 17-year-old Sarah Monroe and 18-year-old Jess Hayes were last seen on a warm summer evening. They had been inseparable friends, known for hanging out at a local diner, and that night, like so many before, they promised they'd be home by midnight. But neither of them ever returned. At first, police dismissed their disappearance as just another runaway case. They believed the girls had chosen to leave their lives behind, as so many teenagers did. But their families never believed that. Sarah had been close with her younger sister Ellie, who was only 13 at the time, and Jess had plans to start community college in the fall. Both girls left behind everything: their wallets, their clothes, even Sarah's cherished diary. For years, the case grew cold. Sarah and Jess became names on missing person flyers slowly fading in the sun, a mystery the town seemed to bury with time. But then, decades later, construction workers made a chilling discovery. While draining part of a private lake during a property sale, they uncovered a rusted shipping container hidden beneath the water's surface. Inside, they found two abandoned cars, vehicles eerily similar to the ones last driven by Sarah and Jess the night they disappeared. Even more disturbing were the fragments of a waitress uniform, strands of hair trapped in the rusted metal, and evidence of what appeared to be human remains. The discovery shook the town to its core, reopening wounds many thought had long been forgotten. The Monroe and Hayes families suddenly had hope and horror. Who had placed those cars at the bottom of the lake and why? And more importantly, had Sarah and Jess been inside them all along? The police were forced to reopen the case, assigning it to Detective Corbin, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for chasing cold cases. Corbin immediately began retracing the girls' final steps, digging into witness statements from that summer night. What he found began to unravel a story far darker than anyone had imagined. Phone records, hidden for years, revealed suspicious late-night calls between Jess's cousin, Robert Hayes, and a man named Adrian Shaw, an older figure rumored to be connected to organized crime. The calls coincided with the very night Sarah and Jess vanished. And when investigators pressed deeper, they found whispers of counterfeit operations, money laundering, and an entire network of secrets tied to the town's very foundations. It was no longer just a case of two missing girls. It was beginning to look like the disappearance of Sarah Monroe and Jess Hayes was part of something far bigger and far more dangerous. But who exactly were Robert Hayes and Adrian Shaw? And why would two teenage girls become entangled in their shadows? What do you think really happened to Sarah and Jess? Was this a crime of opportunity? Or were the girls silenced because they stumbled onto something they shouldn't have seen? Comment your theories below, and don't forget to subscribe as we uncover the chilling secrets hidden in this case. Detective Corbin knew from the start that this case was not going to be simple. The discovery of the shipping container at the bottom of the lake was shocking enough, but it was the details that haunted him. The waitress uniform stuffed into a corner of the rusted metal, the strands of hair caught in the hinges, and the eerie fact that both cars belonging to Sarah and Jess seemed to have been deliberately sealed away, as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase every trace of the girls. The families, long resigned to silence, were pulled back into the nightmare. Ellie Monroe, now an adult, had never stopped searching for answers about her sister. She had spent years writing letters to the police, collecting old newspaper clippings, even talking to anyone in town who might have known something. For Ellie, the reopening of the case wasn't just about closure. It was about exposing the truth. She was certain Sarah hadn't run away. Something had happened that night, and now, finally, there was evidence. Detective Corbin began his investigation by revisiting people who had been close to the girls. Friends remembered Sarah and Jess as normal teenagers with plans for the future. But one detail kept surfacing. Both had recently started working part-time jobs near the edge of town. Jess helped at a small garage run by her cousin Robert Hayes, while Sarah had been waitressing at a local diner. Neither job seemed unusual at the time, but when Corbin looked closer, he began to see patterns. Robert Hayes was not just a mechanic. Records tied him to several shady business deals, including reports of stolen vehicle parts and suspected counterfeit money circulating in the area. His late-night phone calls to Adrian Shaw stood out even more. Shaw was a name whispered in the shadows, a man rumored to have connections far beyond the town, possibly even ties to organized crime. If the girls had stumbled upon something in Robert's garage or overheard something they weren't supposed to while Sarah worked her shift, it might explain why they disappeared. The timeline became Corbin's obsession. Witnesses placed Sarah and Jess together at the diner until about 9 p.m. They were seen laughing, leaving in Jess's car. That was the last confirmed sighting. Hours later, phone calls between Robert Hayes and Adrian Shaw lit up phone records. By dawn, Sarah and Jess were gone, and their cars would eventually end up sealed in a container beneath a lake. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Corbin pressed further, questioning former employees at the garage and staff at the diner. Many were reluctant to talk. Some hinted that Robert had a temper, that he often had visitors late at night, men who didn't look like they belonged in a small town. Others claimed they had heard Sarah mention once that she didn't feel safe at work anymore, though no one could recall exactly why. It was fragments of memory, faded with time, but together they began to paint a troubling picture. The more Corbin uncovered, the more dangerous the case seemed. The possibility that organized crime had stretched its roots into this quiet town was alarming. And if Robert Hayes and Adrian Shaw were involved, then Sarah and Jess were likely caught in something far bigger than teenage mischief. But proving it would be difficult. The evidence from the shipping container was degraded after decades underwater. The cars were rusted shells. The fragments of fabric and hair were compromised. And without definitive remains, the case remained just as uncertain as before. Still, Corbin believed there were answers to be found. He traced Adrian Shaw's history, discovering that he had once been investigated for large-scale counterfeiting, though charges had never stuck. He had money, influence, and the ability to make problems disappear. Could Sarah and Jess have discovered something at Robert's garage that connected to Shaw's operation? Could their disappearance have been a calculated act to silence them? As these questions mounted, Corbin faced resistance from within. Some members of law enforcement argued that the case was too cold, too flimsy to pursue. But Ellie Monroe refused to let her sister's name fade again. She pushed relentlessly for updates, giving interviews, speaking at community events, demanding accountability. For Ellie, the truth was no longer just about Sarah and Jess. It was about a community that had ignored warning signs, a justice system that had failed two girls, and a silence that had lasted far too long. The case now balanced on the edge of revelation. Detective Corbin had uncovered connections, suspicions, and whispers of organized crime, but he still lacked the one thing that could break it open: undeniable proof. And as he pressed deeper, one chilling question lingered over everything. If Sarah and Jess were silenced because of what they knew, who else in town had helped cover it up? Do you think Robert Hayes and Adrian Shaw were directly responsible, or was someone else in the town protecting them? Let me know what you think in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see how this story unfolds. Detective Corbin's next step was to dig into the people who had worked alongside Sarah and Jess in their final weeks. These were individuals who had lived with the shadows of the case for decades, each carrying fragments of memory that might help piece together what happened. At the diner where Sarah had waitressed, older employees recalled a young girl who was hardworking but sometimes nervous. A former cook remembered her leaving the kitchen during shifts to take calls on the payphone, always sounding tense. One waitress, now retired, recalled an evening when Sarah confided that someone had been watching her after work, a car idling in the parking lot late at night. She didn't name the driver, but the waitress was certain it wasn't Jess's car. Small details, vague after so many years, but they carried weight. At Robert Hayes's garage, the atmosphere of secrecy deepened. Some former employees were reluctant to even speak with Corbin, claiming they didn't remember or that they weren't around much in those days. But others, off the record, admitted they had suspicions. One mechanic told Corbin he had noticed cash payments in unusually large amounts flowing through the shop, far beyond what routine car repairs could explain. Another mentioned boxes that were delivered late at night, never opened in front of staff, always taken straight into Robert's private office. Nobody dared question him about it at the time. Corbin also tracked down a delivery driver who had been subcontracted by the garage in those years. He remembered unloading crates late one night and being told to leave them by the back door. No paperwork, no questions asked. The man admitted that, looking back, it had felt wrong. But in a small town, jobs were scarce and Robert paid well. None of these accounts could serve as hard evidence, but they suggested that the garage may have been used as a front for more than car repairs. The connections between Robert Hayes and Adrian Shaw became clearer the deeper Corbin went. Records showed that Shaw had purchased land just outside of town under a false name. On that land, there had once been a storage warehouse that mysteriously burned down in the mid-1990s. Fire investigators at the time had blamed faulty wiring, but locals whispered it was arson, a convenient way to destroy whatever had been inside. Corbin began to suspect that the garage and the warehouse were linked, perhaps both being used as part of a larger counterfeit or smuggling operation. If Sarah and Jess had stumbled onto one of these secrets, perhaps by accident, perhaps by curiosity, it would explain why they were silenced so quickly and thoroughly. Corbin considered the possibility that the girls had been lured somewhere under the pretense of a ride home or a late-night errand, only to be confronted with something they weren't meant to see. The discovery of the cars in the shipping container suggested premeditation. Whoever was responsible hadn't simply disposed of the vehicles. They had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide them, sealing them in steel, weighing them down, and sinking them out of sight. That was not the work of a panicked teenager or a spur-of-the-moment crime. It was calculated. Corbin's inquiries soon began to rattle cages. He was warned more than once by locals that he was digging where he didn't belong. One retired officer even suggested that the original investigation into Sarah and Jess's disappearance had been deliberately stalled. Reports from the 1990s revealed missing witness statements, inconsistencies in police logs, and evidence that had never been processed. Files had gone missing, interviews were undocumented, and critical leads were ignored. Ellie Monroe grew more determined than ever. She began to suspect that corruption had reached into law enforcement itself. She spoke to reporters, insisting that Sarah and Jess's disappearance was not just a tragedy, but a cover-up. Families of other missing young women from nearby towns even reached out to her, wondering if there might be a connection. Could this have been part of a broader pattern of exploitation and silencing? Meanwhile, Corbin pieced together a darker possibility. That Sarah, while working at the diner, may have overheard something about shipments or cash drops connected to Robert's garage. Perhaps she confided in Jess, and together they tried to confront him or simply stumbled across incriminating evidence. Their youth and innocence would have made them easy targets. But if Robert Hayes had orchestrated the disappearance with Adrian Shaw, he hadn't acted alone. Moving cars, securing a shipping container, and submerging it in a lake required more than one pair of hands. That meant others in the community may have participated or, at the very least, looked the other way. Corbin's investigation now raised questions that reached beyond two missing girls. How deep did the corruption go? How many people in this quiet town knew the truth but chose silence? And most chilling of all, if Sarah and Jess had been silenced for what they knew, what else had gone unspoken all these years? As Corbin prepared to confront Robert Hayes directly, he couldn't ignore the growing danger. He wasn't just reopening an old case. He was stepping into the ruins of a network that had thrived on secrecy. Each new lead was a reminder that Sarah and Jess's disappearance wasn't just about two missing girls. It was about a community's darkest secrets, buried beneath decades of silence. And for every answer Corbin uncovered, more questions emerged. Who helped sink the cars? Who ordered it? And why had the case been allowed to grow cold for so long? Do you think the police deliberately ignored the case? Or were they simply outmatched by something bigger? Share your theories in the comments, and if you're hooked on this investigation, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story. Detective Corbin eventually turned his focus directly to Robert Hayes, the man whose name had surfaced again and again in the investigation. Robert had been younger at the time of Sarah and Jess's disappearance, in his early 20s, but even then, his reputation carried weight. He was known as charming when he wanted to be, but with a temper that could ignite without warning. In the years since, he had built himself into a figure of quiet influence in town. His garage was still running, though its business had slowed, and he had maintained just enough respectability to keep suspicions at bay. When Corbin first approached him, Robert denied everything. He insisted he had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance, claiming he had been working late that night, closing up the shop. But Corbin had already seen phone records that told a different story. Calls between Robert and Adrian Shaw that stretched into the early hours of the morning. When confronted with this, Robert grew defensive. He claimed Shaw was nothing more than a business acquaintance, someone he had dealt with for parts and supplies. The explanation was thin but technically plausible. Still, Corbin pressed. He asked Robert to account for why the cars had ended up at the bottom of the lake, sealed in a container. Robert shook his head, saying he didn't know. But his composure faltered when Corbin mentioned the fragments of fabric, the strands of hair, and the possibility of DNA testing. For a brief moment, Robert's mask slipped. He leaned back, silent, staring at the table, before regaining his calm and asking for a lawyer. The interview ended, but the silence spoke volumes. Adrian Shaw was harder to pin down. By the time Corbin reopened the case, Shaw had moved out of state, living in relative luxury in a gated community. He had never faced serious convictions, only whispers and failed investigations. Shaw declined to meet in person, speaking only through attorneys who dismissed the entire matter as a local tragedy, long ago, with no bearing on Mr. Shaw. Still, Corbin kept digging, and what he uncovered was chilling. Financial records from the time suggested that Shaw had poured money into the area just before the girls disappeared. Bank transfers, shell companies, and property purchases painted the picture of a man laundering funds through small-town businesses. Robert's garage was one of those businesses. Witness statements placed Shaw visiting the garage late at night, often when no one else was around. If Sarah or Jess had stumbled into the garage on one of those nights, they might have seen something or someone they weren't meant to. As Corbin's investigation deepened, Ellie Monroe's fight grew louder. She began appearing in the media, telling her sister's story, putting pressure on the police to pursue every lead. Her interviews were emotional but unwavering. She spoke about Sarah's kindness, her dreams, and her determination to build a better life. Ellie also spoke about Jess, reminding the public that 2 families had been destroyed, not one. Each time, she ended with a demand for justice. Her persistence kept the case alive in the public eye, making it impossible for local authorities to ignore. But the more visible the case became, the more resistance Corbin encountered. Files disappeared from archives. Calls went unreturned. A source inside the department quietly told him that he was stepping on toes, that powerful people wanted this story left in the past. Even more disturbing, anonymous warnings began arriving. One note, slid under Corbin's office door, read simply, "Let the dead rest." Another time, his car tires were slashed outside the precinct. These weren't random acts. They were messages. Still, Corbin refused to back down. He pursued Shaw's connections, tracking down associates who had once worked under him. One, a former driver, admitted that he had ferried sealed boxes from Robert's garage to Shaw's warehouse late at night. He claimed he never knew what was inside, but the deliveries were always accompanied by strict instructions. No stops, no questions. The driver had long since cut ties, fearing for his own safety. His testimony was shaky, but it reinforced Corbin's growing theory. Sarah and Jess had accidentally uncovered the pipeline between Hayes and Shaw, and they had paid the price. But what haunted Corbin most was the shipping container. Someone had gone to extreme lengths to ensure those cars and whatever evidence they contained were hidden. It would have required a heavy-duty vehicle, access to the lake, and careful planning. He began to wonder how such an operation could have gone unnoticed in such a small community. Unless, of course, it hadn't gone unnoticed at all. Corbin revisited the property records around the lake. He discovered that, at the time the girls vanished, the land had been owned by a company traced back to Shaw. It was sold quietly years later, only to resurface when developers drained part of the water during reconstruction. The shipping container had been sitting there all along, on land once under Shaw's control. It was almost too perfect, as if the land itself had been chosen to conceal evidence. The revelation shook Corbin. This wasn't just about Robert Hayes or Adrian Shaw. It was about a network of silence that stretched into real estate, finance, and law enforcement. And all of it had grown around the disappearance of two teenage girls who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Corbin connected these dots, he realized he was nearing the limits of what he could prove. The physical evidence had decayed beyond use. Witnesses were fading, their memories unreliable. And those who might have known the truth were either dead, too frightened, or too protected to speak. But the families deserved answers, and Corbin was determined to give them at least a glimpse of what had really happened. Two teenagers disappeared on an ordinary summer night. Their cars were hidden in a steel coffin at the bottom of a lake. Their names became whispers of a tragedy few wanted to revisit. And yet, every clue pointed back to the same dark conclusion. Sarah Monroe and Jess Hayes had not vanished by chance. They had been silenced. Who ordered their silence remains the question that lingers. Was it Robert Hayes, desperate to cover his tracks? Was it Adrian Shaw, ensuring his operation stayed hidden? Or was it both men, working together, protected by others who had everything to gain from keeping the truth buried? The answer may never be known, but the shadows left behind by their disappearance still hang heavy over the town. And as long as their story remains unresolved, the question will continue to haunt anyone who dares to look too closely. Sarah and Jess's disappearance may never be fully solved, but their story demands to be remembered. Who do you believe was behind their fate, Robert Hayes, Adrian Shaw, or someone else entirely? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery we uncover.